sustainability advisor, and well-known British environmentalist. For more than 25 years, he has worked for developing a more sustainable society at local, national, and international levels, from providing ecology and conservation experiences for elementary age school children, to making the case for new recycling laws, to orchestrating international campaigns for rainforest preservation and climate change. His work has promoted change at many levels. He's presently works as a special advisor to the Prince of Wales, believing in political change is necessary to make the transition to a more sustainable society. Tony ran as a candidate of the Green Party in the Cambridge constituency at the 2010 general election, and that campaign nearly tripled the Green Party vote in Cambridge. What has nature ever done for us? His first book was published in the UK in January 2013, where following many favorable reviews is quickly becoming a bestseller. And as we said earlier, Synergetic Press, Tango has very, with her visionary lens, published this wonderful, important book. So I look forward to all of you having time now with Tony.
Right. Thanks very much indeed, Gabe, for that very, very kind introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today, and there's really three reasons for that. First is to see old friends in the form of Randy. We campaigned alongside each other for many, many years, and I think it did make a difference. There's still more of a difference to make, but at least we made a start. Second reason is to be hearing more from the great visionaries behind the Biosphere 2 project, which is the first part of my book, really, an incredible metaphor for the way in which we should be looking at the world as the means of supporting human civilizations at all levels. An incredible piece of work, the most important piece of ecological research of the 20th century, I would say. So it's a real honor to be in the company of people behind it, and indeed people who went on the voyage inside Biosphere 2. And listening to Mark's remarks, I just kind of feel very enriched in having that further perspective. And then the third reason it's a great pleasure to be here is because my new book is coming out in the United States, and I have the most incredible publisher in the form of Synergetic Press and Deborah. Thank you so much. Because this is a message that I think is beginning to take hold, and so I'm very excited about the prospects for this book making a small contribution to the change that we need to make. And it's really interesting listening to people this evening and Randy's remarks about the nature of the challenge we face, and I agree 100% that we don't really live in a world where we face environmental problems, really. It's really about economic change is what's needed. It's an economic problem that we've got. And I come to that conclusion from many years of campaigning and looking back at what we did over the last 30 years as a group of environmental organisations and individuals and thinkers. We did a great deal. We've managed to cut air and water pollution in many parts of the world. There's many more protected areas than we had before. There's increased public awareness. There's some activity by some corporations going in the right direction. But if you look at what lies ahead, you can quickly conclude that actually we're nowhere near where we need to be. Levels of greenhouse gases are building up in the atmosphere, not only causing the climate to change, but causing the oceans to become more acid. There's a mass extinction of animals and plants underway, caused by habitat destruction, pollution, and climate change now on top of that. And then you look at rising demand, a population not only going towards 9 billion, but a population that's increasingly middle class. People in the developing world rising to European and North American lifestyles, putting even more pressure on the natural resource base of fresh water, of soils, of fish, amongst other things. So we're not in a good place, and we've become actually in an even worse place in the last few years. When I stepped down from Friends of the Earth in 2008, I'm wondering to myself, what am I going to do now in terms of locating myself in the continuing discussion? And I could see then that actually we were in danger of going into reverse on the environmental agenda. And the reason for that was the economic crisis. We had a financial collapse and governments everywhere desperate to restart the engine of economic growth. And predictably in the United Kingdom, as has happened in Canada, I'm hearing today more stories about that and what's happening in this country, the policymakers are trying to roll back environmental rules, not increase them, because they're trying to kickstart the old economy. An old economy that's not only failed in an environmental and social sense, deepening inequalities, causing environmental challenges like climate change, it's also collapsed in a financial sense. And so rather than trying to rebuild a new economy, they're trying to put superchargers on the wreckage of the old one and take us back towards the idea of so-called economic growth. In the face of that, it seemed to me that we needed to make the counter-argument, the economic argument, which is about ecology, and to challenge what is perhaps the deepest misconception in human history, whereby policymakers and leaders of global corporations and people running the financial sector would have us believe that somehow there is a choice to be made between protecting the environment and promoting economic welfare. It's insane at so many levels, and yet that prevails in terms of the media debate and the choices being discussed by legislatures right across the world. And so now is the time for us to seize the agenda and to expose that misconception and put the world on a new path. And that's why I wrote What Has Nature Ever Done For Us? To hopefully be a small contribution in turning that great tanker towards a different view of the world we inhabit. And since I left Friends of the Earth over the last 5 years, I've had the incredible privilege of being able to work with all sorts of people who've been digging into this subject. So I'm no economist, and I make no apology for writing in a book about economics, because I noticed over many years how many economists are not shy in talking about environmentalism. So actually I think it's brilliant that we now put the boot on the other foot and stride boldly into the world of economics with a little bit of common sense. And that's what this book is trying to convey, really, is a little bit of common sense based upon a great deal of very good science that's been conducted by some really very clever people in recent years, and I've been able to work with some of them. And in the book, I try to tell their story of what they've discovered, but also to hopefully present this material to a much wider audience through talking about the subjects through stories. And the story I begin with is the story of Biosphere 2, this incredibly powerful metaphor where we're confronted with the reality of a sealed system. And that sealed system is very similar to Biosphere 1, the world in which we inhabit. There is a limited capacity to what it can do, and it can only do what it does if the systems that interlock to maintain the life support systems are carefully maintained and husbanded. And that is the powerful opening piece that takes us into the story of soil, that world beneath our feet, which has the cultural metaphor in many parts of the world as dirt. We like to wash it off, we like to concrete it over. And yet this particular subsystem of the Earth, the Earth's living fabric, underpins our welfare in so many different ways. Of course, it's vital for food production. It's also vital in ways that are only just beginning to be understood in terms of climatic stability. And the readers in the new book are taken to a place near to where Sue and I live in East Anglia, in England, just north of Cambridge, a place called Holme Fen. Now, if you'd gone to Holme Fen back in the 1850s, you would have been in one of the largest lowland lake in England, an area of water spanning across several square miles above a big layer of peat. And the peat had formed at the end of the last ice age when the sea levels had risen, backing up the rivers over these flat plains of East Anglia, leading to the vegetation being smothered in this aquatic habitat, not rotting away, accumulating this great body of unrotted plant remains. This body of unrotted plant remains was, in the mid-Victorian era, seen as a huge economic opportunity in terms of being able to boost food production. So the peat was drained, the pumps were installed at Whittlesea Mere, this great lowland lake, and within a year the place was dried out, ready to receive wheat planting. As this was going on, a local landowner called William Wells brought up from London a great piece of iron from the Great Exhibition, which was staged the year before, and he inserted this piece of metal through the peat down into the clay beneath, and he fixed the piece of metal with wooden stakes so that the top of the metal was at ground level. This is in 1852. You go up there today and look at that piece of metal, and the top of the piece of metal is nearly up to the ceiling in here. Because what's happened is that once the peat was dried out and the water was removed, the carbon in the unrotted plant remains was united with oxygen, and it turned into carbon dioxide. The land literally evaporated. Many hundreds of millions of tons of carbon dioxide has gone into the air because we drained the land in order to be able to grow wheat. And as we've seen the progressive oxidation of the peat, not only have we lost a massive carbon sink that's contributing to CO2 in the atmosphere, we've also jeopardised food production into the future because that peat is now getting very thin, and in some parts of the East Anglian Fens, this is hundreds of square miles, bear in mind, a massive area of wetland, we're now down to the clay. And once we're down to the clay, that's the end of farming. So the way we abuse soils is not only jeopardizing food production, and bear in mind that 1/3 of agricultural soils across the earth since the middle of the 20th century have become degraded in some ways. And I'm often reminded when I go to developing countries and hearing about soil erosion, actually right on my doorstep, we have very good examples of what's going wrong with how we look after this very complex subsystem. And this complex subsystem is indeed complex. I met some soil scientists during the course of writing this book and was just mind-boggled by what they were telling me about the work that they're doing in trying to understand the ecosystem that sustains plant growth and indeed is doing so many other things in terms of maintaining atmospheric stability, filtering water, and is the place where nutrients are exchanged between rotting material and the plant growth, which is fundamental to all ecosystems. And for example, if you take a tablespoonful of agricultural soil from a healthy area near to where I live in Cambridgeshire, you go back to the laboratory, you put that soil sample under the electron microscope and start counting, you'll need a long time to get to the total number of bacteria in that soil sample. Something like 6 billion you might expect to find individual bacteria in that one sample. And of those 6 billion bacteria, if you've got the time to do the genetic work, you might find 20,000 different species. And not only are there bacteria, there are fungi, there are nematodes, there are springtails, and huge, great big organisms like earthworms, all interacting in this ecosystem that is doing so much for life on Earth. The atmosphere, the water, and of course the food production. And then if you start to look at the interactions between these different organisms, these tiny little microbes in the soil, you begin to realize that there's some very interesting relationships have emerged between them over many millions of years. And so, for example, the actinobacteria have developed chemical weapons to fight off bacterial attack. And that chemical weapon that they've developed, in fact a range of chemical weapons, many of you in the room, most of us might have used those at some point because they're called antibiotics. These chemical weapons are what sustain modern medicine and indeed modern agriculture in being able to beat off bacterial attacks that cause the infections that cause so much hardship in farming and indeed in human health. So we're relying on these chemical weapons that were developed beneath the ground, and indeed chemical weapons developed above the ground by the plants and the animals which rely on them in similarly complex natural selections taking place in the ecosystems above ground. And have a look at the United States pharmaceutical market. If you look at the scale of this, it's worth about $600 billion per year in this country, and about 50% of that is based upon compounds first invented through natural selection. And of course, that same natural selection is the basis for all of our food. So all of the crop plants you see growing here on this ranch, and indeed across the whole of New Mexico and in the whole world, that is based upon genetic solutions developed by plants and animals over many millions of years. And indeed, the future of agriculture, many would argue, in our uncertain world of new diseases, climate change, extreme weather, and everything else, perhaps the strongest insurance policy we have in maintaining global food security going forward is the wild relatives of those particular organisms, of the animals and plants that we've domesticated. On top of the medicines and on top of the food supply, in terms of what nature's doing for us through those evolutionary relationships, there's a whole new discipline emerging that goes under the name of biomimicry, literally to copy nature. And during the course of writing this particular piece of work, I came across many examples of where nature is inspiring new thinking in the human world. So one example relates to termites and how these organisms, which are so small and look so unintelligent, have developed the means to maintain stable atmospheric conditions inside their termite mounds. So if you go to some of the tropical regions, you see the termite mounds above the ground. If you were to measure the temperature inside there, you'd find that it stayed at about 16 degrees all the time, day in, day out, night and day. Even though outside, at the height of the sunshine in the daytime, it's going to 28 degrees. At night time, the temperature may drop down to 6 or 7. Inside that termite mound, it stays the same. The termites do not have a nuclear power station. They do not have a solar panel. They do not even have a wind turbine. What they're using is design. Through the invention of evolution, they've managed to work out how to ventilate with tubes and columns the inside of their mound to be able to maintain conditions that are optimal for their particular way of living. Imagine what we could do if we were able to use the termites' inventiveness to design our own buildings in order to be able to cut 40% of carbon dioxide emissions through simple design. Don't need nuclear. We don't need renewables even. What we need is clever design, and the termites are one source of what potentially could be an incredible breakthrough for the way in which we construct our cities into the future. Another example I came across is already being used by the Chrysler Motor Corporation. This is the invention by the boxfish of a tough skeleton which can enable it to withstand the attacks of predators. This has been used to build a new car body design. It uses less steel than the earlier designs and is stronger than what was previously in use. A fish invented that first. I came across a lady in South Australia who's looking at the trick being deployed by the tiger snake in being able to keep its body temperature up in very raw, cold conditions that blow up from the Antarctic Ocean. This snake has developed the means to be a very effective solar collector. It can keep its body temperature up at about 20 degrees when the ambient temperature is about 7 degrees. If we could understand how that snake is doing that, imagine what kind of technologies we might be able to deploy in the cooler northern and southern parts of the world. Carbon neutral technology has been invented by a snake. Super efficient fibre optic cables. Starfish and sea urchins invented some of the basis of that a very long time ago. Geckos walking on ceilings, different kinds of adhesives. And then there's the cautionary tales that we learn when we don't pay attention to the embedded value that this kind of invention holds for humankind. And I came across the example of the gastric brooding frogs. These amphibians, which were from Australia, had developed the method of hosting their tadpoles inside the stomach of the adult frog to stop them being predated so much. So if the tadpole was swimming in a pond as it grew up, ducks, fish, everything else would make a meal of it. By being inside the adult frog's stomach, less likely was it to be predated. Some physiologists thought this was very interesting because by rights, those tadpoles should be digested by the adult frog. Its gastric juices, very powerful corrosive chemicals, they should have digested the tadpoles. So the tadpoles must have invented some means to resist this chemical attack, and the scientists looking at this thought, well, this could be a clue for a cure to peptic ulcers, in the sense of being able to create a cure for something which afflicts many hundreds of millions of people worldwide. The scientists went back to the frogs to find out what this chemical was. Unfortunately, both species of gastric brooding frog had gone extinct. Their habitat had been destroyed, and with those animals was taken this particular evolutionary trick, which could have had such huge implications for the improvement of human health worldwide. Some of these things you think, well, we can see the economic value potentially of biomimicry, we can see the economic value of soils. A whole other layer began to emerge as I was discussing this narrative with myself as I'm gathering the research. And in fact, John Allen is one of the people who really put this thought in my mind about not only the things in nature which are important for its functioning, but the relationship between the things is what keeps the whole thing going. And in our reductionist society, we tend to like to look at one thing at a time. We like to study this animal or that plant, when in fact the whole system is glued together by relationships rather than the individual pieces. And every now and again we get glimpses of what this means in a practical sense and in terms of what that value might be from an economic point of view. Perhaps the most obvious set of relationships that we know about in the sense of sustaining the human economy and civilization is pollination. So out there in the woods right outside this dome, there are interactions going on between animals and plants. And in fact, in this place, you get the most amazing example of bird pollination going on. There's hummingbirds going between the flowers. That's a wonderful thing to see. There's also bats doing some of this work. Most of it, of course, worldwide is being done by insects. Butterflies, beetles, flies, and of course, most importantly, bees. And the bees in particular help to sustain global food production. Now, the work being done by pollinating insects as they go about their work, completing the life cycle of plants by moving pollen to create seeds and to generate fruits, this has an estimated value to the human economy in the sense of the sales of the products that come from pollination. It's about $1 trillion per year. So we're starting to get some serious numbers now in terms of what these animals are doing for us. And if you look at the particular piece of work being done, the transfer of pollen between the flowers, that's been estimated by a technical process that reported in 2010 to the United Nations to be worth about $190 billion per year. That's how much the work being done by bees is worth to the human economy. Not a small figure. And you think, okay, well, that's fair enough. We can rely on the bees, can't we? Because they're kind of out there, and we shouldn't worry too much about them declining. But then you read around some of the recent research about bee declines and collapsing colonies in different parts of the globe, and the causes for this. is complicated, a combination of habitat destruction, the style of farming we've now adopted with monocultures rather than diverse agriculture, and of course the impact of chemicals, including the new neonicotinoid pesticides, which cause these quite alarming behavioural problems in bees and causes in the end the colonies to collapse. And if you start to look at what that might mean, then perhaps there's a few examples out there that tell us the kinds of implications that might be ahead. And one story I write about in What Has Nature Ever Done For Us is the story of what happened in parts of southwestern China during the 1980s, when very heavy pesticide use was encouraged by the government in order to boost food production, in order to boost the production of apples and pears. And the effect of this was to kill the pests. They did kill the moths and the insects that were eating the fruit. They also killed all the pollinators. And if you go to that part of southwestern China today, you will find entire villages in the spring climbing the fruit trees with feather dusters, moving the pollen between the blossoms by hand. The people have got to do it themselves because they've killed the pollinators. So that makes this very real in the sense of what that $190 billion free service looks like when you take it away. It means that people have to do it themselves. So they can't educate their kids. They can't be decorating their house. They can't be driving a taxi or doing other things that could productively add to their welfare because they're having to do the work that was done for nothing by the bees before. And then when it comes to relationships, I came across some incredible research about the way in which nature sustains human health. And there's a whole body of stuff out there about the beneficial effects of greenery and being able to walk by running water, to be able to see trees during your day-to-day experience, to hear birdsong. An incredible body of literature around all of that, which I think should be radically changing the way in which we're designing cities and everything else. But on top of all of that, there's some amazing research about the way in which diseases are in part controlled by the relationships that exist between different bits of the natural world. The most high-impact story that is in the book, I think, which lots of people have remarked about, is the effect of India's vultures going extinct between 1993 and 2003, more or less. These birds used to be very common. I was in India in 1993 and saw these birds in the cities, in the countryside. There were about 40 million of them in those days, and 3 species of gyps vulture. By 2003, they were down to a few tens of thousands. They were functionally extinct. And the reasons these birds were wiped out so quickly was the inadvertent consequences of a chemical called diclofenac, which was in very widespread use in veterinary medicine. You inject a cow or a buffalo with this stuff, and its sicknesses become less obvious. It can get back to work in the fields. It can be producing milk once more. And so this was a wonder drug that was being used very widely by rural vets. What the rural vets didn't realise, or anybody else for that matter, was that if an animal was injected with this stuff within a week of its death, then there would be residues in the flesh, and that residue, in tiny quantities, would cause organ failures in the carrion-eating birds that fed on the dead carcasses. So a carcass by the side of a field in 1993, it would have attracted maybe a couple of hundred vultures in an hour or so. They would have cleaned it instantly, pretty much. In an hour or two, the thing would have been down to bare bones, and the bare bones, incidentally, were useful for making fertilizer. But the bare bones weren't left there because the vultures had been wiped out. And as a result of the vultures being wiped out, the job they were doing meant that 12 million tons, would you believe, of rotting meat was left in the countryside uneaten by the vultures. Of course, this is then a source of disease like anthrax and insect-borne diseases with maggots feeding on the rotten flesh was one hazard. A bigger hazard, however, came in this nutritional windfall being available for something else. Some other carrion-eating, scavenging animals found this to be highly beneficial. Principal beneficiary was India's wild dog population. As the vultures went down, researchers plotted a sharp rise in the number of dogs. Wild dogs, not pet dogs you might have in a basket by your front room. These are nasty things that go around in packs. They've got diseases and they bite people. And these animals were biting lots of people. With 7 million more dogs, that's a number that they rose by, there were many more dog bites in the countryside, leading to an estimated 50,000 additional deaths from rabies than would have occurred had the vultures still been there. The vultures were creating a buffer. They were helping to control a vector of a very nasty disease. The combined effect of the different impacts of the vulture's loss, the bone industry, they used to leave the clean bones for people to make fertilizer, the costs of having to clean up now that the vultures weren't doing it, plus the public health costs, plus some other costs. A conservative estimate is that the loss of the vultures between 1993 and 2003, it cost the Indian economy about $34 billion, would you believe? Really quite a staggering sum, and one that wasn't factored into the economics of deciding whether it was a good idea to use that particular drug. Closer to home here, I came across a really amazing piece of research looking at the outbreak of West Nile virus in the United States in 2002. And some of you, I'm sure, will remember this in terms of there being quite a few deaths in this country, of course, very considerable public health costs, much human misery. This was caused by the transmission of a virus that causes brain inflammation. It was transmitted by a mosquito. And researchers looking at the way in which this disease spread after the outbreak was over found some really interesting data. They found that after they'd looked at the socioeconomic factors, the way in which people's settlements were constructed, the kind of area where people were living in terms of the local vegetation, they found that they couldn't explain the lumpy way in which the infections emerged across the country until they looked at something that nobody really had thought about before. They looked at wild bird diversity, and they found that where the wild bird diversity was highest, the infections were lower. And the reason for this is because the mosquito that spreads West Nile virus, it would rather bite birds rather than people. It's an avian specialist. It feeds on the blood of birds. When you reduce the bird diversity, the mosquitoes have to feed on something else, and people is the next easiest thing to feed on. How many public health organisations look at the economic value of birds in being able to control these very costly kinds of epidemics? Not many, I would argue. And then I burrow into another set of relationships in terms of how the natural world works and start to look at the contribution being made to agricultural pest control by different kinds of animals. A few examples that came out of the literature which I was really staggered by. One included a really top piece of research by some Dutch workers who looked at the effect of songbirds feeding in an orchard. And there's a beautiful little orchard down here, and I was walking there with Sue earlier on today, and we were speculating about the effect the birds were having down there. But these researchers, they didn't do speculation, they did proper data collection, and they excluded these birds, called great tits, from one half of the orchard, and they encouraged them into the other half of the orchard by putting nest boxes up. And when these birds are feeding in the spring, they eat a lot of caterpillars, and the caterpillars are the principal cause of damage to the fruit in the early season. So if you can control the caterpillars in April and May, you're going to get a better fruit harvest. What the researchers didn't realise is how much better a fruit harvest you got, because the bit where the birds were excluded, you got 50% less high quality fruit than the place where the birds were encouraged. A massive difference, just by these birds going about their daily business. And the economists, of course, looking at the economics of agriculture, I'm sure they'd be advocating the sale of chemicals, because you can put that onto a balance sheet. You can show whether a company sold chemicals, it's made money for its shareholders, it's contributed to GDP. These birds, doing a really economically valuable job, completely ignored. A very powerful piece of research. Another study that was conducted in this country looking at the effect of a bird called the evening grosbeak and its economic contribution inside forestry plantations. These birds are voracious caterpillar predators in the springtime when they're feeding their babies. And the contribution they were found to be making was quite staggering. If you have a commercial forestry plantation producing timber and producing pulp for paper making, you get more of the pulp and timber every year if you have less of the leaves being eaten, because the leaves, of course, is the engine room for the plant to be able to lay down the woody material. If you cut the number of insects, you get more wood. And the value of this, in terms of what the grosbeaks were contributing every year, it was found to be $1,500 per year per hectare. You start scaling that up to big areas of forest, and this is a major economic actor. These little black and yellow birds feeding their chicks are actually making a massive contribution. And I have to tell Mark that today we were down there and we saw blue grosbeaks feeding chicks. Yeah. So the pest control, the pollination, the disease control, things that perhaps we find quite surprising when it comes to what the natural world is doing for us. Something maybe we take for granted even more than all of those things is this stuff, fresh water. There is a vanishingly small quantity of this on Earth. We have about 1.6 billion cubic kilometres of water. Nearly all of it is salt. 0.3% of it is fresh, and of that 0.3%, only a vanishingly thin sliver is actually in the liquid form that we rely on. And you wonder, where does this stuff come from? So in many Western countries, we get used to turning the tap on and maybe we buy it in a bottle. And that's, for most people, where the story ends. But the contribution being made by natural systems, it couldn't be more fundamental. And I was staggered when I started to drill into the research on this one. Most of us probably know that water, in its fresh form, it comes principally from the oceans. With the sun beating down on those great expanses of water, the water evaporates, it turns into water vapour. And then it turns into those clouds, which are so dramatic in this parts of the world. And sometimes I try to think of the clouds as like great kind of airborne rivers. They're transporting the water from the oceans into the continental interiors, dropping down the rain that enables the vegetation to grow and all the plant communities to be able to inhabit the land surface. What I found surprising, because I kind of understood a little bit about the water vapour, what I didn't realise was about the cloud seeding process and the extent to which you need little particles in the atmosphere to make the clouds form in the first place, to go from vapour to condensed bodies that then travel. And one of the things that apparently is creating much of the cloud on Earth each day is the tiny plankton drifting in the surface of the ocean, because they produce substances that create tiny particles in the form of dimethyl sulfide. It's a byproduct of the metabolic processes undertaken by the plankton in completing their life cycle. They release this material into the air. You can sniff it if you go to the seaside. That stuff unites with oxygen to form sulfate particles, and that's why there's so much cloud on the Earth. And of course that stuff travels, these great airborne rivers transporting water around the planet. And without that, frankly, life on land would be very different. And then, of course, when it hits the land, the water isn't simply going into taps, is it, really? It's being treated in certain ways by different bits of the natural ecosystems in order that we can use it. Some of it is being held back in mountains by wetlands and forests. Some of it is being filtered into groundwater, into aquifers, like the water we're drinking right here today. It's coming out of the ground because there's some soil somewhere else, I don't know where, possibly some distance from here, that's infiltrating it into the rocks rather than it just running straight off back down into the sea. As is happening, I hear from the news here yesterday, as a result of fires damaging some of the desert soils here, so the water's running off more quickly. So soils are vital for getting this stuff into the taps. And then for this stuff to be transported around some of the continents, another factor is often involved in the form of massive areas of tree growth, forests. Forests evaporate the moisture back through their leaves into the atmosphere, and then through the pollen grains coming off the trees, the water is reseeded into new rain clouds. And across the Amazon, the water is being recycled about 6 times between the coast and the Andean mountain range on the other side of the continent. That's happening across the globe. And some ecosystems are particularly important in sustaining water security in the dry season. In some parts of the world, so-called cloud forests exist in mountain areas about 2,000 metres above sea level. You find particular ecosystems that harvest moisture from the clouds. They hold the moisture in deep leaf litter, release it into springs during the dry season, and the water flows when otherwise it's not raining. Dar es Salaam in Tanzania is an example of a city that relies on cloud forests 200 miles away in order to keep the water supply running in the dry season. It's not raining down in the lowlands, but up in the mountains, the trees are literally harvesting moisture from the clouds. That's the freshwater cycle, just a tiny sketch of it. And then, of course, that other bit, that vast amount of water that is the salt part, is literally sustaining the entire planet in other ways. Well, for a start, it's supplying many of us with nutrition. We get about $274 billion worth of GDP per year from wild fish. That's in terms of the catching, the selling, the retailing, the processing, the boat building, the net maintenance and everything else. And then on top of that, we have those same plankton not only sustaining the food chain that leads to the fish, but also, as I said a second ago, helping to make it rain. And if you just take a breath of air in this room, those same plankton are responsible for at least 50% of the free oxygen we just breathed in this very room, through the photosynthesis they're doing in the top of the ocean. And in addition to the fish, the rain, the oxygen, they're soaking up about 1/3 of the carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere every year as well. And think about the money that's being spent on renewable energy, more efficient vehicles, nuclear power stations. That little layer of green at the top of the ocean is doing 1/3 of the job for nothing. one estimate as to the value of the oceans annually to the human economy by Robert Costanza and his colleagues at Stanford is that it's worth about $21 trillion per year. That's the value of the ocean if you start to boil it down into bald economic terms. And you may think to yourself, well, surely the oceans don't need to worry about that too much. That's one thing we haven't really done much damage to. But the thing that makes my blood run cold is looking at some of the science around ocean acidification and what the implications of that might be. I call it the other carbon dioxide problem. I think some of us have become aware of the climate change challenge. But when you start to look at the implications of the oceans turning more acid and what this might do for various shell-forming organisms, including some of the crucial plankton groups, the coccolithophores, which rely on forming shells to complete their life cycle. If they can't form their shells, those animals become much less abundant. Marine food chains begin to collapse, the carbon cycle becomes even more out of whack, and potentially we even begin to impact on the oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere. That's why the oceans are so important. And then, of course, around the edges of the ocean, we have massively important ecosystems for humankind as well, in the form of the mangrove swamps, the coastal salt marshes, the seagrass beds, and the other ecosystems that help to defend low-lying areas from extreme conditions that come with tsunami waves and with extreme storms. And there's a whole body of information that I review in the book telling us about the value that we get from this insurance policy that fringes the world's oceans, where these natural ecosystems reduce the power of waves and storms and help to protect coastal property. And one piece of work that I looked at just compared the effects of Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita, where these two storms came ashore a few hundred kilometers apart in the Gulf of Mexico in 2005. Both Category 5 hurricanes. One caused utter devastation, massive loss of life, and huge economic costs, about $85 billion worth of damage. The other one killed very few people and did little property damage. And one admittedly came ashore over a densely populated area, another one a less densely populated area. But the principal reason why these two storms were so different in their impacts was the state of the coastal wetlands. Around New Orleans, they'd been degraded, and the waves' power went pretty much unabated into the city. Where Rita came ashore, there was 16 kilometers wide of coastal salt marshes that took the power out of the wave. And unlike a concrete sea defense, those salt marshes adapt themselves to changing sea levels. They can rise as quickly as the sea level is rising because of climate change. A real insurance policy, should we choose to protect that into the future. So when you start to add it up, the carbon capture, the plant growth, the biomimicry, the medicines, the pollination, the disease control, the defences of the coastal areas, the oxygen we breathe in the atmosphere, the replenishment of fresh water, the recycling of nutrients. What's nature ever done for us? And yet, in many finance ministries across the world and many boardrooms, that argument still prevails, that there is somehow a choice to be made between protecting the ecosystems and growing the economy, when of course it's quite obvious to anybody who thinks about it, you have no economy if you take away the ecology. And hopefully that can start to get through in the years ahead as we begin to understand some of these numbers. And in terms of the aggregate overall number that goes behind all of those different things that nature is doing for us, the best estimate, I think, that remains out there today by Robert Costanza again and his colleagues tells us that nature is worth at least double global GDP every year. So those services, the pollination, disease control, water replenishment, that's worth about twice as much as the bit of the economy we're measuring. And the bit we're not measuring, the nature, we're liquidating to grow the other bit. At some point these two lines will cross. And it's really a question of whether we can start to bend the curves, as was being said by Randy earlier on, whether we've still got time to do this. And of course, it seems that we have, if we can mobilise the incredible resources of humankind to be able to fuse these two systems, the ecosystem, the biosphere, and the human economy. And in the book I talk about the need for the emergence of a bioeconomy. And again, this was very much inspired by the thinking behind Biosphere 2, where the system was designed, the human economy was designed in the context of the nature, not something that's separate to it. And that merging of these two views, of the environment and the economy, I think is the great challenge of the 21st century. But fortunately, we have everything we need to do this. We have all the technologies, we have the policy tools, we have the economic instruments. The thing we have to shift is the narrative. This is the thing I've come to learn over many years of campaigning, is that people look at the world through different frames. And the frame we're looking through the world at the moment, or many people are looking at it, it's a frame of a choice, economy or ecology. The frame we have to create is one where it's both together. And the idea of a bioeconomy, I hope, will be one that gains massive traction, and that we will look back in this period in 50 or 100 years' time, and we'll see a very different world ahead to the one we see now. Thanks ever so much for listening.